Political Capital is brought to you by Uber Canada. Learn more at uber.com/flexibilityworks.
CHEK Podcasts.
Hey everyone, and welcome to Political Capital, your source for all the latest in BC politics. I'm your host, Rob Shaw. We say it each and every week, another busy week in BC politics, but too bad. It's true. It is a week in which we are going to discuss the end of the carbon tax, the end, partly, of a controversial piece of legislation, at least a section of it, Bill 7, some federal election, and more, all on the docket here on this week's show. We're going to bring in the pod squad. Allie Blades is away for the federal election campaign, but we have Jeff Ferrier here and Jillian Oliver. You know them each and every week. They help us break down all the wild, increasingly wild, perpetually wild developments, mostly stemming out of the U.S., but also here in BC as well. Thanks to both of you for being here. Let's jump in on the carbon tax. We're going to start with the carbon tax. It seems like at least the last couple of years, we have been talking about the political debate over the carbon tax, to scrap it for affordability issues, to keep it for climate issues. This week, in an all-night session, 2 a.m, the NDP passed their repeal of the carbon tax legislation. The consumer carbon tax, partly in response, the Premier said, to federal Prime Minister Mark Carney in one of his first moves, eliminating the federal version of the consumer carbon tax. So we start there. There's a lot of debate about how it was passed, the price at the pump, what happened afterwards. Do we have any other plan to address emissions and the consumer side of emissions? What do we do with the giant revenue hole left in the budget, Jillian? Many questions. It turns out eliminating the carbon tax was the easy part. Figuring out what to do in the wake of it is challenging. What's your first sort of take here on how it ended and what it means?
Yeah, it was quite something. We had this policy in place for 17 years, first implemented by Liberal Premier Gordon Campbell, and gone in a day. It was pretty remarkable. And, you know, I mean, there's so many interesting things that kind of happened in the fallout. I think the gas prices obviously was the one that everybody was watching. They, had kind of climbed in the week before as gas companies were sort of anticipating this change, then kind of fell. And then it was only a couple of days before we saw them back up. So I think, it was interesting to hear politicians like David Eby and Mark Carney, who have previously supported it, sort of talk about it. They're still kind of defending it as a policy, but saying that it had become too politically toxic, and that's why we needed to move past it. And I think, they were kind of proven right when you saw that the affordability that had been promised by opponents of the carbon tax didn't really come to bear quite in the way that was, I think, commiserate with the sort of ire that they had been raising about it for the last couple of years. And then, still lots of questions remaining about the revenue side, what exactly the implications of that are, how big of an implication that's going to be. The government has said they're sort of taking a pause, reviewing government spending, these sorts of things. I don't think that we're going to see something like similar to replace it. Probably it's going to end up more on the deficit side. And then, in terms of actually addressing the emissions, because there's lots of evidence that it was an effective policy in reducing emissions, or at least keeping them lower than they otherwise would have been. It'll depend, I think, largely on the outcome of the federal election. Carney's got more policies that are sort of more on the regulation side. And so, it'll be interesting to see how those come to bear, how they start to affect prices of things. And lots still to be determined on the future of this, I think.
Jeff, I, for one, am shocked, I tells you, that taking away a tax in the oil and gas sector was immediately gobbled up hours and days later by the oil and gas companies. I am shocked that this occurred. $3 billion hole in the provincial budget, more than 3% of all revenues gone to provide a 17 cents a liter gas savings that is now apparently mostly gone anyways, all within the span of a couple days. That's a tough political circle for any party or any politician or anyone of any stripe to sort of square here.
Is that a question?
No question. Moving on to our next topic.
First thing I'll say is if Allie were here, she's not, but I think we want to give some voice to what Allie would say because viewers at home will expect it. She would say, happy Axe the Tax Week. Big savings for everyday British Columbians happened because of Pierre Poilievre and John Rustad's principled advocacy on these tax issues that was totally not about winning votes in elections. And enjoy the savings. They'll be long-lasting, and it's a huge victory for British Columbians. And I hope No Context BC doesn't take that as, take out the first part where I said that's what Ali would say, not me. But anyways, I think the BC government, Premier Eby, made this decision for political reasons, which is not surprising because it's politics. On the political side, with federal-provincial relations, with both of the main parties in the federal election promising to eliminate the consumer carbon tax, at least. British Columbia was looking at a situation where it and Quebec would have been the only provinces with this carbon tax in place, and that would have been politically fraught for the Premier. I think there's also the reality that anyone who's lived in British Columbia for the last 10 years knows that this is a dire time for affordability. It's only going to be made worse by Trump's tariffs. We're dealing with a lot of folks who are paying more for groceries, juggling bills, watching their gas gauge with anxiety. And that's the reality here. The NDP made a promise. They're keeping the promise. Prices came down for a little bit. Mission accomplished. Not really. I think we'll need to have the BC Utilities Commission on the job, making sure that the oil companies who everyone knew would try and recoup the tax for themselves, for their own profits. That's going to be important. This is some help for people with their pocketbooks, and in a world that's getting more volatile, BC is going to have to do this and more to strengthen the economy and protect affordability.
We don't regulate the price of gas in British Columbia like the Maritime provinces or Quebec, but I do think there's going to be a discussion about it at this point when you provide those savings and they're instantly gone, or much like, a sale at a store where they mark the price up first and then give you the discount so you're paying the same price. Like, people are going to look at this and go, that is not what I thought I was getting with the Axe the Tax discussion for the last 2 years. But Jillian, the BC Greens, the only party to vote against repealing the carbon tax. And one of the points that they made was there's no backup plan here. There is no other environmentally friendly initiative, no climate focus in the wake of the carbon tax. Emissions have not really dropped from our 2007 levels. We're not really on the path that politicians had said the carbon tax was going to help get us onto. So what happens now? What is the pressure? Is there any pressure on this government to do something on climate, or in the environment that we're in right now with the Trump tariffs, with cost of living, with a global trade war? Is there any pressure on the NDP to replace the carbon tax with something else, do you think?
I think that the pressure on climate policy tends to, follow incidents of extreme weather. We've been having those most years. There's a big storm out east right now that's very expensive. I think that in the short term, like this year, it depends largely on the kind of summer that we have and the costs that we have. The budget for wildfire contingencies is very low, much lower than what we've actually had to pay in recent years. So I think that's going to be a big piece of it in the short term. I think in the longer term, yes, these extreme weather and the cost of climate change are going to continue to climb. They cost between $10 and $17 billion in 2021, at a time when BC is facing big questions about its budget, the deficit. That's going to continue to be a bigger and bigger question mark. And how are we going to pay for climate change ultimately, I think it, is absolutely critical. And it's just impossible for that issue to go away.
Jeff, what do you think of that? And also the Premier's response to the question is, well, we're going to keep the industrial pollution-based output side, which of a $3 billion revenue stream in the carbon tax is worth $200 million. Presumably it's going to grow, but he's also facing pressure to not grow it because he's trying to encourage projects to be fast-tracked that might get derailed by a sudden new tax? Where do you think the government goes from here?
I think there's two issues here. There's the climate issue, and then there's the fiscal issue. On the climate side, the NDP does have measures in place to go after climate change. I think for the Greens, it's not enough, but it's important to note that we do have output-based carbon pricing for industry in the province that's going to grow over time, and that's an incentive to for those companies to curtail emissions. You're also seeing electrification of the economy, BC Hydro with government making massive investments in wind and solar, with more procurements of that on the way. And net zero requirements for major industrial projects that happen in the province by 2030. On the fiscal side, this does create challenges for government. The province has a record deficit. And so the question is, for me on that front, is what can BC do about that? I think it's, we've talked about this on the show before. It's about moving projects, industrial projects, job creating, revenue creating projects through environmental reviews and other approvals processes quicker. You don't reduce the stringency of those processes, but you do them faster, so you can get to yes or no faster. We're in a moment of big global risk, and I think this is how BC fights back on that front, on the fiscal front, on the economic front, and I think that's front and center in the minds of most folks right now.
A couple of things on that. On the fiscal side, obviously the province kind of rocked this week with 2 credit rating downgrades. That makes it even harder to accommodate the revenue loss from the carbon tax. Politicians more sensitive about that. And then also on the climate side, there's lots of stories just as we're recording here on Friday about a new sort of definition of net zero for big LNG projects in particular, where the government's going to grant a little bit of an exemption to get those projects going. If they can't connect to the electricity grid, they're not going to be penalized for not doing it until they can. And that might be a little bit of movement, Jeff, in the way you're saying on between climate and quick resource economic development. So we'll keep an eye on that as well. All right, we are going to switch topics though to the tariff issue. And I know we keep talking about it every week, but it was Freedom Day, or whatever U.S. President Donald Trump called it, Global Tariff Day. At the time that is happening, changing the global economic landscape, the BC government has Bill 7, its tariff response bill, on the floor of the House. They're trying to change it to address some of the concerns that it gave the Premier potentially the power to amend any law and regulation without the legislature's approval for 2 years, and the Premier agreeing to back down on that part of the legislation. So, tariffs. Jillian, we'll go to you on this. Everyone trying to figure out what the Trump administration is doing. What do we think of BC's tone, the Premier's sort of response here the last few weeks? We've been on break, the way he's addressed this, and his willingness to move on Bill 7 in response to criticism that it was a bit of an overreach.
Yeah, I think it's so wild how quickly things have been changing. I think what we've seen since we first started talking about this issue is that sort of vacuum in leadership at the federal level has become smaller as the federal election has sort of taken precedent. And Mark Carney's kind of stepped into a real leadership role and kind of been a bit of a stronger voice, like centralized federal voice on the tariff issue. I think that's taken away some of the spotlight from the provinces, from the premiers, and sort of we've seen the premier kind of almost soften and adjust his tone in that way, where, before we kind of had premiers almost posturing like they were, the leaders of Team Canada. So I think, and I think, the blowback from Bill 7 being seen as an overreach has sort of softened things a little bit. And I think the changes to Bill 7 seem reasonable to me. They are more what we expected when they first announced the legislation, more specific to deal with removing interprovincial trade barriers, targeting trucks heading to Alaska, and Buy BC initiatives, and also some of the changes that the Greens wanted in exchange for their votes on the legislation to make the sunset clause just 1 year instead of 2. So there's a little bit more accountability built in there. So I think, both the blowback to the bill specifically, as well as the changing federal landscape, we're sort of seeing that reflected in a bit of a change of tone from the premier, where he's a little bit more kind of staying in his lane as a premier instead of a prime minister.
Jeff, what do you think? Given the last time we checked in with you before spring break, I believe, I'm just going to check the exact quote here, you were in favor of dissolving the legislature and appointing, in your words, El Presidente to have supreme power and throw Rob Shaw in jail. I think that was your original position on Bill 7. Have you moved at all on the need to change this bill?
Look at the government.
That was a direct quote, by the way.
Yeah, I wanted to change the name of the bill to the Throw Rob Shaw in Jail bill, but that was rejected by the government. They took out Part 4 of this bill. For folks at home, that's the part of the bill that would have allowed government to change laws and regulations unilaterally, would have to report to the legislature every 6 months on that, and do it in looking back retroactively. It's a political call. It was meant to address concerns and keep people on side. From a policy point of view, I still think it should have stayed in. I might be the only person in British Columbia who believes that, because I think when you're dealing with someone like Donald Trump, showing strength is a key. But, here we are. And, the big issue isn't so much what's in the bill. And I think Jillian described that really well. It's about, what's changed and what that means for BC and Canada. We have a relationship with the United States that's ruptured. It's a permanent shift. For decades, we had trade deals, we had cooperation. That's not there now. For a province like BC that is highly dependent on trade, this matters. It's not just about government. It's about jobs for folks in forestry, mining, and manufacturing. BC has to respond. I think it should have had kept more tools in the toolbox to protect the economy, but what they've landed on here seems to be more politically palatable to folks, and so here we are. That's what we're doing.
Yep. Well, it's a good thing.
I, for one, though, say let's keep those civil liberties in the hands of politicians.
Right.
I'm kidding.
That's fine. Another issue that has occurred during our spring break is a federal election has been called. We were all waiting for it. It sort of ended up becoming that fait accompli at a certain point, but we should just stop and talk about, just in a kind of high level here, what do we think BC's impact is in this federal election? Is it a battleground? What do we make of the polling that seems to show this resurrection of the federal Liberals under Mark Carney? Hollowing out or lowering down of the Conservative momentum a little bit, and a kind of very difficult position for the federal NDP, which has a strong dozen seats or so in BC, and looks like it's cruising for a bruising, to use a political science term that is not a political science term.
I think that was Stuart Press. Stuart Press said that.
Oh, did he say that?
That's his thesis. Cruising for a bruising.
Yeah. It's a good
trends in
master's
BC politics
to defend. Jillian, what do you think of the federal election dynamics here and how they're playing out in BC?
Yeah, BC is an interesting province. Normally it's a three-way race, and that's how it was looking a couple of months ago between the NDP Conservatives and Liberals. We also have, one of the only Green seats in Elizabeth May's riding. There's been another Green seat in Nanaimo Ladysmith before. I think there's only been 4 Green MPs ever, I think, maybe 5. So lots of interesting dynamics here, following the trend that they're seeing across the whole country, where Mark Carney, assuming the Prime Minister's role, has really skyrocketed things. I think, in the face of the Trump threat, people have shifted from fully wanting change to wanting like a little bit of change as well as stability. And I think that's really kind of what's driving that dynamic. In times of crisis, people look for stability. And I think Carney's also done a better job of sort of meeting the tone that people are looking for. Watching him this week, he just has this very slow, kind of assured, confident way of speaking that I think is reassuring for people. And he's got such a simple story that he's been an effective manager in times of crises. And I think that looks like it's going to be the ballot box question, but we've still got a debate. He's still untested in that kind of an arena. So it's going to be a really interesting one to watch. And then, for the NDP and the Greens, it's a really tough landscape. I've run, as a third party in a crisis time before. It's really, really hard. When fear is really driving political motives. And it's going to be really interesting to see whether the NDP can sort of continue to eke out victories, kind of based on the strengths of their incumbent MPs and their ground game, which I see they had some stories out this week trying to kind of tout that to sort of push that viability narrative. And we also saw the Premier come out and say, re-elect existing NDP MPs, and kind of stopping short of endorsing the full slate or the prospect of growing it. So I think they're kind of in save the furniture mode, and it'll be interesting to see how much they really can save.
Yeah, it is a crisis election, it feels like, Jeff. Kind of a little bit like the COVID election, maybe, but with the American presence just looming so large. What do you make of it?
I think Jillian's right about what the ballot question is. It's the same in BC as it is everywhere across Canada. It's Canada-U.S. relations that's driving a liberal-conservative fight for the government, federal government. I think it would, if an election were held today, if voters cast their ballots today, I think the Liberals and Conservatives would keep the seats that they have, perhaps with the exception of the seat in Abbotsford where Mike DeYoung is running as an independent, and that the Conservatives would pick up NDP seats in rural British Columbia. I think that's what they're targeting. So, North Island, Courtenay, Alberni, Port Moody, Coquitlam, suburbs in the Lower Mainland. And I think the Liberals they're targeting urban NDP seats in surprising places like Victoria, Vancouver Kingsway, where Don Davies is a very effective MP, Peter Jillian, the MP in New West Burnaby, and Jagmeet Singh's own riding in Burnaby Central. I think on the NDP and the Greens, for the NDP, I think their strategy is to position themselves as the necessary counterbalance. This is going to be only really viable if the Liberals continue to trend upwards and voters say that's going to be inevitable, that they're going to win. The offer there is you can't a government that is so big will lose touch with the needs of everyday people, and that's why you need to elect New Democrats. I think it's more of an urban play, and conservatives are doing much better in rural BC and are taking up that space. Tough election. The last point I want to make is I would never say on this show that folks in Saanich and the islands should elect someone who's not Elizabeth May.
I know you're wearing green today.
Yeah. That's going to play well on the podcast.
Generous of you.
I would never say that. I think people should definitely elect Elizabeth May.
Oh, yeah, you've got okay. The fingers are crossed now. So yeah, that's we're going to have to carve out some time to have a federal kind of check-in in the weeks ahead. It is tough when the BC news cycle is moving so quickly, when things are occurring internationally. It keeps changing the landscape daily. So we'll try to come back on that. We've got more to discuss in our podcast edition this week. So make sure that you subscribe. Check us out on all the podcast platforms for the latest there. You can also check us out on the CHEK Plus app and keep in touch with us that way. Thank you to Jeff and to Jillian for being here. Thank you for watching, and we'll be back next week with all the latest in BC politics here on Political Capital. Political Capital is brought to you by Uber Canada. Learn more at uber.com/flexibilityworks.